Hello, I'm Ranger. I've been working on this analysis of Tears of the Kingdom for the past 4 months. When the Hyrule Hideout Discord server was opened in 2020, the Zelda community was at an in-between stage after the tremendous success of Breath of the Wild and was eagerly anticipating the advent of its sequel. With many people having either been brought back into the series or having entered the Zelda fandom through Breath of the Wild, a direct follow-up to the game in the same world was an exciting prospect. With Tears of the Kingdom having finally released on May 12th, after the longest wait between mainline titles, we are now at the end of an era and beginning a new one. Alongside this analysis, I also created my own rating system, the Triforce rating. According to the Triforce rating, the quality of a creative project is dependent on the creative elements of execution, design, and ideas, interesting and innovative ideas, design choices to implement these ideas, and how well everything comes together. At the end of the video, I will provide my Triforce rating, which instead of a score will show what elements the game is made of. This video was initially to be released to coincide with the Hideout's 3rd anniversary, but in the style of the Zelda series I had to delay. That doesn't change the fact that this video was made as a celebration of the history of the series and of the servers, and I hope that it was worth the wait. And with that, let the video begin. When talking about Tears of the Kingdom, it is impossible to not talk about Breath of the Wild. In a first for the series, Tears of the Kingdom reuses the exact same world of its predecessor. This may sound like a situation similar to Majora's Mask, which was built out of recycled assets and managed to be one of the most memorable games in the series. Reusing an entire world, however, had never been done before up until Tears of the Kingdom. Something that is not immediately obvious is just how significant the world is to the cohesion of a Zelda game. Each iteration of Hyrule is built according to the gameplay mechanics the game is designed around. By not only reusing the world of a previous game but keeping it mostly untouched, as the developers didn't want to lose the identity of the world, Tears of the Kingdom inherited game design elements that it could not escape from. Understanding this is essential to comprehend what made Tears of the Kingdom the game it is. Shrines needed to return, memories needed to come back, durability could only be tweaked rather than reworked entirely, the entire gameplay loop of finding resources as a reward for exploration had to persist, etc. The Zelda team had locked themselves into imitating Breath of the Wild's structure and could only change smaller aspects through new abilities and bolting on new areas to pre-existing Hyrule where they could. Apart from that, they needed to double down on Breath of the Wild's elements to justify Tears of the Kingdom being a full-priced game. This meant more resources, more Koroks, more enemies, more shrines. Hyrule needed to stay the same, and the only way to go was to add more of it. The decision to reuse Breath of the Wild's world had many more ramifications than one might expect. The wholly new additions to the world come in the form of the Sky Islands and the Depths. Given that Hyrule could not lose its identity, these new areas could only be grafted to Hyrule rather than integrated into it. As a result, the Sky Islands, beyond the tutorial area, are resource farming and shrine gathering areas spread disparately across the sky. There is no sky settlement with its own inhabitants to give the sky its own identity beyond the many empty islands that all share the same aesthetic. The Sky Island's biggest contribution to Hyrule is to drop stone blocks all over the world, both to provide a means to get up to the sky as well as giving Hyrule a slightly new look. The Depths are the more substantial addition to the world, considering they actually span the entire map. Much like the sky, the Depths are made up of the exact same Zonai ruins, even in places which should have indigenous structures. The darkness and light root mechanics act as a barrier to prevent the player from exploring freely in order to add something more to the resource grind that defines all encounters in the Depths. There is a plethora of resources, most notably Zonite, to extract and enemies to fight, but everything blends together in the single uniform biome that extends throughout the entire underground. Scattered across the Depths are chests containing DLC or amiibo items that return from Breath of the Wild. While the fact that these items are included with the base game is nice, especially considering Tears of the Kingdom is the first Nintendo game to have its price increased, being rewarded with something that's already known is a huge demotivator to explore. And even if the recycled nature of the weapons and armor found in the Depths could be overlooked, they offer no insight into what the Depths are in the context of Hyrule. The Depths, being a resource and recycled item repository, makes their novelty evaporate very fast. Beyond this, Hyrule itself has been shuffled around as best as the developers could, being bound to preserving Breath of the Wild's Hyrule. Cave systems have been added which, paired with the Ascend ability, change the way the player interacts with the world. However, they fill the same roles as the Depths and Sky Islands by being material farming sites alongside the occasional shrine. The exact same ruins from Breath of the Wild that remain are at odds with the alleged reconstruction of the kingdom, especially when important places like Hyrule Castle or the Temple of Time remain just as abandoned and monster-ridden as they were after the kingdom's collapse in Breath of the Wild. By and large, Hyrule is the same as it was in Breath of the Wild. It has the same shrines, the same Koroks, the same settlements, and the same characters. Dropping zonai structures here and there is not enough to change this fact. In the absence of meaningful changes to the world, Nintendo attempted to change things up with new mechanics, but their attempts at making a wholly new experience was hobbled by the shackles of the very world they wanted to preserve. In the developer interviews, they explained that the genesis of Tears of the Kingdom was from them hacking together vehicles with Breath of the Wild assets using dev tools. The prospect of making a vehicle crafting system must have seemed like the perfect gimmick to base a game which was reusing an entire world on, and so Ultra Hand was born. Ultra Hand, as it's cheekily called in English, is nothing short of a technical marvel, but it was not the best solution to reusing a world. Put aside the finicky nature of building itself, Ultra Hand shifts Hyrule from a land to explore and become familiar with, to a resource exploited to build machines with. On top of this, the game is not designed for exploring the full potential of Ultra Hand. The dungeons make very simple use of it instead of being designed around teasing out the nuances of the system in clever ways. Instead, to experience the full breadth of Ultra Hand, one must invest time and resources to make a vehicle that not only may not be useful, and whose resources cannot be reclaimed, but is not designed to persist past loading screens. Vehicles are then by design disposable resource sinks rather than integral parts of the game, and any use of a vehicle upon starting up the game will require resources one way or another. Durability could not be fundamentally altered with Nintendo wanting to keep the world and all its associated design choices intact, so the developers settled for tweaking it. Resources found in the world are now more useful than ever with the ability to fuse them to weapons. This allows a large variety of weapons with different properties and effects that can be made at a moment's notice. Unfortunately, the weapon crafting is undermined by the bafflingly poor UI. Arrows must be refused individually, causing repeated freezes in gameplay, and the huge number of items means the quick select bar and inventory get very tedious to scroll through. Finding the right item you want to fuse is half the battle, which drives a wedge between the player and combat. On top of this, fuse introduces quite a bit of grind. Acquiring resources becomes more important, but some are more useful than others. This creates the problem where you don't want to waste your rare materials due to how difficult to obtain they are, but cannot use the low power materials either because fights with them take too long. This is the same problem Breath of the Wild's durability had, simply under a different name. Ascend and Recall are the abilities that are best integrated in the game, and Recall actually happens to be slightly relevant to the story. Ascend's ability to traverse the world vertically is a game changer, but much like Ultra Hand, it encourages skipping sections of the world. Ascend ends up being a loading screen on demand and is mostly useful for leaving caves rather than being used for interesting puzzles. Recall is the most interesting ability and feels the most at home in the game. The ability to rewind an object's position in time is extremely interesting and allows some very cool things to happen. But like Ascend and Ultra Hand, it's not integrated into the dungeons and barely is in the story. Recall's chief value in that aspect is to separate Zelda from Link. The other new addition is the Sage Ghosts as a new version of the champion's abilities. Having AI-directed NPCs who can soak up enemy aggro, and in some cases provide some real help in battle, harkens back to Wolf Link in Breath of the Wild, who was underbaked but a really cool idea. But they end up being more of a nuisance than anything else. I've mentioned several times that the mechanics of the game are not integrated into the world. To some this is fine, as the process of maliciously building mechanical horrors or grinding for resources simply for the mercantile pleasure of it can be its own fun. However, Cohesion is important because that is how Zelda narratives arise. The story of Zelda is told through no one thing, not through cutscenes, characters, or lore alone. Indeed, if you looked at Ocarina of Time's story, one of the most beloved in the series, on paper it is fairly unremarkable. The themes of time travel and coming of age are not particularly new. Does this mean that Zelda's stories have always been mediocre and that its fans are deluded of their quality? No. Zelda narrative is emergent. It is the sum of many different parts. It's the intersection between dungeons and music, cutscenes and characters, items and outfits that coalesce into a narrative that is greater than its individual parts. In other words, the magic of a Zelda narrative is the identity of the game and its world in which it takes place in. To that effect, since the Zelda team have no dedicated writers, the story is developed alongside the game rather than made separately. It is baked into the gameplay and the world. The particular identity that each game possesses is thanks to the convergence of everything that goes into making these games. These elements that give a Zelda game its narrative are present in a skewed capacity in Tears of the Kingdom. Being derived from Breath of the Wild, Tears of the Kingdom's identity is locked into being a remixed version of its predecessor. With the shrines being identical in design and function, and the main gimmicks being about building and skipping through the world rather than breathing new life into it, the dungeons are the most important addition which could provide Tears of the Kingdom with a unique distinguishing factor. But while the dungeons are technically closer to classic dungeons, they cannot escape Breath of the Wild. Dungeons are once again an exercise in activating terminals to get access to the final boss, but without the added interactivity that controlling the divine beasts offered. Without this, there is no standout unique gimmick, as dungeons do not provide new gameplay opportunities for Ultra Hand or any of the other abilities. The music in the dungeons is also beholden to Breath of the Wild by being a build-up of the leitmotif of the champions, despite the fact that they are no longer relevant in Tears of the Kingdom. Despite the fact that the dungeons are supposed to be ancient sites linked to each race of Hyrule, the shared Zonai architecture completely papers over Hyrule's different unique cultures. The Spirit Temple is the one exception to this because its sage is actually a Zonai, making the Zonai aesthetic fit. Assembling a mech by extracting its parts piece by piece through several puzzles is the most intricate use of Ultra Hand in the entire game. Unfortunately, the mech itself is slow and requires resources which would be better suited for weapons, making it no better than another aggro sponge to add to Link's cavalcade of ghosts. The Spirit Temple is also the last dungeon in the game, and with the final boss not actually having a dungeon of its own, the opportunity for new uses of the game's mechanics ends there. Tears of the Kingdom is the first Zelda game in the history of the series where the elements of the game do not contribute towards its identity, but all pull in different directions without coalescing in any way. The Master Sword is the perfect example of this. As the Blade of Evil's bane, its shattering would be a cause of great alarm, and its restoration would be the #1 concern, as it's the only thing that can beat back the spawn of Demise. But instead, it's taken away from Link and returned to him no more special than any other weapon in the game.
The Master Sword is the key to destroying the Demon King.
Nope.
The developers even removed its base damage number, likely to encourage the player to fuse things to it. The Master Sword isn't the Blade of Evil's bane anymore. Its only useful quality is that it's a renewable hilt. Hylia's first gift to her people is now as useful as a monster horn grafted onto a stick. It's not even necessary to beat the final boss. As previously explained, the narrative of a Zelda game comes from multiple different sources. Cutscenes only help to reinforce the story through different events that change the stakes of the game. Since Tears of the Kingdom is beholden to Breath of the Wild structure, the bulk of the story must once again be locked away in the past and explained through memories. With the reused world muddying the environmental storytelling the game can do, the burden of proof lies very heavily on the cutscenes, heavier than in any other Zelda game. Being lengthier and of quality hitherto unknown to the series, the cutscenes have the opportunity to convey more information than ever. The story content itself, however, is at odds with the world, the gameplay, and the series itself. Much to the glee of Zelda tubers everywhere, the mysterious Zonai from Breath of the Wild are the focus of Tears of the Kingdom's story. But rather than being a new chapter in Hyrule's history, they rewrite it entirely. In Tears of the Kingdom's ancient Hyrule, there is no Master Sword, no Triforce, not even a Hyrulean leader, nor any sign of the Sheikah, the royal family's sworn bodyguards. The banner flown is not a Hyrulean banner, but a Zonai one. The throne room is Zonai, and the king himself is Zonai, and isn't even from Hyrule. Ancient Hyrule isn't Hyrule at all, it's a Zonai colony. The cutscenes do not show us anything else. Despite the higher amount of information that could be conveyed, all we know for sure is that Sonia is not its leader, despite being native to Hyrule, her foreign husband is, as the game is intent on reminding us.
I remain the king of Hyrule.
And now you rule as king, and have taken a Hyrulean woman as your wife.
As it stands, Hyrule's origins have been retconned from being the return of a people in exile to being the colony of technologically advanced anthropomorphic animal outsiders. And that's if we take the game at its word. Nintendo's waffling about if ancient Hyrule really is retconning Skyward Sword makes it seem like they don't even know themselves, and the Zonai's inclusion begins to feel like an afterthought. There was a vital opportunity in these cutscenes to teach us about who the Zonai are, especially considering they're supposed to be the good guys. But with the supremely limited information we do get, whether or not this was the intention of the story, the Zonai seem more like oblivious colonizers at best and malicious invaders at worst, rather than rulers who genuinely have Hyrule's fate at heart. We never see more than a grand total of 2 Zonai, so there is no way to know. The one familiar thing returning in Tears of the Kingdom is Ganondorf. This is the first time since 2006 that Ganondorf has been the primary antagonist, and the first time in the series, barring the multiplayer-focused Four Swords adventures, that Ganondorf has not been the same man from Ocarina of Time. Ganondorf was historically in pursuit of the Triforce, as it was the most powerful magical artifact in the world, and the reason why Hyrule is so special in the first place. In the ancient Zonai colony, however, there is no Triforce, and Ganondorf is thus after the generically named Secret Stones. These are Zonai magical items whose function, in practice, eclipses their users. While the Triforce is nothing less than divine power itself, and its full power can only be used by those who are worthy, Secret Stones are nebulous in nature, and can presumably be used by anyone who touches them. In fact, the only thing that's known for sure is that if you swallow one, you get permanently changed into a dragon, but this has nothing to do with their average use. While the Secret Stones are said to be amplifiers of innate power, this is never conveyed. Nobody in the past is seen using their powers without their stones, which gives the impression that it's the stones themselves that give power. At best, the stones may give their users the ability to make a phantom of themselves. Despite his impressive physique, Ganondorf does not perform any show of strength which would establish him as a credible threat. Instead of punching a hole in the mountain bare-fisted, he commands an underling to send some Molduga to attack a fortified stone fortress, despite the fact that Molduga can only swim through sand and are thwarted by anything that isn't. This is the equivalent of sending dolphins to attack a heavily armored battleship. This portrays Ganondorf as neither smart nor strong in his own right, but simply generically evil. On top of this, the actions of the king makes Ganondorf's villain credibility fall to near zero. The Goat King knew that Ganondorf was evil and so decided to welcome him into his kingdom so that he could keep an eye on him. As far as we're shown, this did not include having a Sheikah shadow Ganondorf or any action of any kind to safeguard his kingdom or even his own wife. Therefore, when Sonia gets her spine shattered and Ganondorf immediately ascends into his final boss form well before we actually fight him in the present, it makes it seem like this near-instant victory was due to the king's incompetence rather than Ganondorf's own actions. Thus far in analyzing the story, Zelda's role has not been mentioned. This is because her role borders on insignificant. The moment Zelda is sent to the past, she becomes a witness to the story of the game. She spends the near totality of the story standing by the sidelines watching Ganondorf take over. Breath of the Wild story centered on Zelda's struggle to unlock her power to be able to seal Calamity Ganon away. It was simple, but it tied into the state of the world and gave Breath of the Wild a clear and distinct identity. In Tears of the Kingdom, Zelda's power is almost a red herring, because not only does it not achieve anything, it's not what gets Zelda back to the present. Zelda never directly confronts Ganondorf, despite being the queen-to-be of the kingdom that is being threatened by him. Instead, she stands aside as Sonia is killed, and the entire kingdom is destroyed off-screen without her being able to do anything. Zelda's only role in the story is to fix the Master Sword, but she does not do this herself. Zelda's sealing power from Breath of the Wild, which is retroactively joined by her time power and light power, which serve no real purpose, turns her into an energy generator. The Master Sword requires this energy to repair itself over a very long period of time. So after Ganondorf has been sealed away and Hyrule has been destroyed, Zelda swallows her stone and turns into an immortal dragon to float around the sky so that the Master Sword can suckle on her until the present day. It doesn't matter who Zelda is, what she wants, or what she does, as long as she can unconsciously nurse the Master Sword for eons. Given that the process of draconification is permanent, and strips someone of their sentience for all eternity, there is a real tragic element to Zelda turning into the Light Dragon. It would also give a new lens through which to view the other dragons in the game. Perhaps they too were characters turned into dragons long ago, maybe even the goddesses themselves, but the dragons are just as aloof to the story, dungeons, and world as they are in Breath of the Wild. Zelda's draconification would actually be tragic if it was a real sacrifice. After Ganondorf is defeated, the king's ghost returns from the beyond just to turn Zelda back, and before leaving again, as an added bonus, restores Link's arm. With the major events of the game being undone with no consequences and Zelda's agency being severely curtailed with no satisfying outcome, the entire story feels more like the imitation of a plot, devoid of any substantial narrative. So far, this video has talked about the world, the gameplay, and the story, but there's one last essential element to a Zelda game: Link. Link is a rare protagonist because he is both an avatar for us to project ourselves into and a character that has a life of his own. Link is constantly walking a tightrope between a completely blank slate and a fully fledged character. It is through Link that we experience the world, through someone who has a place in and lives in Hyrule. It may be the Legend of Zelda, but it is through Link, our Link, that we get to experience it. In Breath of the Wild, Link was an amnesiac emerging into an unknown world where next to nothing remained of his previous life. The intrinsic desire to figure out what happened aligned us perfectly with Link's in-universe motivations and helped us to become him. Tears of the Kingdom repeats this, with Link being unknown by the majority of Hyrule and having no home to speak of despite his many great deeds only a few years prior. The mystery of Zelda's house is a good summary of Link's estrangedness from the world he lives in. In Breath of the Wild, the house in Hateno Village became Link's new home in an unknown world. It was a subdued but memorable part of the game. In Tears of the Kingdom, there is no evidence that Link lives there anymore. After the bedroom eyes Zelda gives Link at the end of Breath of the Wild, it's not much of a stretch to imagine Link and Zelda at least being roommates. The house in Hateno has every sign of it being solely Zelda's, almost as if Link lost ownership of the house in a messy divorce. There is word that in the original Japanese version of the game, the Hateno house is referred to as Link and Zelda's house, but research on the matter turns up nothing conclusive, so it might be an urban legend. Regardless, everything in the house points towards Zelda being the sole inhabitant. The weapon mounts have been replaced with pictures likely taken by Zelda, the desk is occupied by Zelda's diary, and more importantly, there is only a single bed. In every other house in the game, there is exactly one bed per person living in the house, unless the building is a public facility. There is only one single bed in the house at Hateno with no extra rooms. Zelda's very journal mentions absolutely nothing about her and Link living together, or even where Link is living at all. On top of all this, the inhabitants of Hateno act as if Link is a total stranger, casting doubt on the idea that Link ever lived in Hateno, or that the Breath of the Wild house side quest is canonical to Tears of the Kingdom. The idea of Link and Zelda living together is very attractive after everything they went through in Breath of the Wild, but you need to ignore a lot of details to believe that Link has been living in Hateno since the events of the game. This alienation is echoed throughout the rest of Hyrule. People either don't know Link at all, or only know him through his work like Pura, Paya, or Sidon. The only person who is confirmed to know the man behind the hero spends nearly the entire game floating through the sky devoid of her sentience. Link thus has no place in Tears of the Kingdom. The only thing tying him to Hyrule is his duty as Zelda's knight. But Zelda is missing for the majority of the game, and her draconification is not something Link can do anything about. And with the dungeons being for the benefit of the champion's descendants, as the repeated dialogue about the imprisoning war can attest to, Link doesn't feel needed. He isn't even involved in repairing his own sword, which is the only other thing that purportedly makes him important. Link doesn't even have any connection to Ganondorf, who only knows of him through hearsay, making the final confrontation lack impact. With Link having no home, no close friends, and little agency in the story, we as the player are cut off from Hyrule. Link cannot offer us insight into what life in Hyrule is like, and thus we cannot get a firm grasp on what is happening. Link is the secret ingredient that makes the Zelda magic we know and love, and he's missing from Tears of the Kingdom. And now for the Triforce score of Tears of the Kingdom. The developers had to be extremely creative after committing to keeping the world the same, and came up with some unique and interesting mechanics they were able to get running on 8-year-old hardware, but were limited by the very pledge they had made. Not enough to grant a wish, but it was a commendable and very good try. Despite the roaring success of the game, it's one of the strangest in the series, on par with Zelda 2. If you can't get enough of Breath of the Wild's world, and don't mind experiencing it again with some tweaks, or like building machines and grinding for resources, then you might enjoy this game. If you haven't played Breath of the Wild, then I recommend you play it first, so that you can experience the world in its purest state. As critical as this analysis has been, I am only more excited for the next game. With a recent interview confirming that the Zelda team have no plans for DLC, it's possible they have already begun work on the next entry in the series. Tears of the Kingdom's failings were due to the devs being overzealously creative due to self-imposed constraints to the point of their reach exceeding their grasp. A game with an entirely new world would be able to avoid many, if not all of the pitfalls of Tears of the Kingdom, and would certainly have a stronger identity of its own. Despite these blunders, this shows that the Zelda team is bubbling with creativity and a desire to innovate. This bodes well for the future of the series, and I have no doubt that this creative spirit will endure for many more entries. Thank you for watching. This is my first Zelda review and has been taking up my mind since the beginning of summer. With many Zelda content creators focusing on the bespoke lore of the game, I hope that as another Zelda fan, I can contribute to a different perspective on the game while we prepare to enter the next Zelda cycle. I want to thank the many members of the Hyrule Hideout Discord who helped me put my thoughts in order through many long conversations, including Yaban, Zelda Elf 90, Snapjack, Crackety Back, Devious Diggy, Yarntastic, Mifa, Small Mifa, Galileo Potato, and more. I also want to thank the YouTuber Zeltic for providing exciting speculative content since the Zelda Wii U days, Vinny Vinesauce for providing a different perspective on the game through his streams, and the YouTuber Nerl for his biting Tears of the Kingdom video that helped me reflect on my own points. And finally, a very warm thank you to the entire Hyrule Hideout community. My life would not be the same without a place as wonderful as the server where I can share my Zelda enthusiasm with people who care as excellent as you all. And of course for everyone, and again, thank you for watching.